Good afternoon. My name is Gloria Garafulich-Grabois, and I am the director of the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture at Seton Hall University. On behalf of the Institute, our partner for this event, Inside the Vatican magazine, and today's speakers, I would like to welcome you and I would like to thank you for joining us for this online event on the topic of Follow the Science with G.K. Chesterton and Father Stanley Jaki. A conversation with Dr. Robert Moynihan, editor of Inside the Vatican, Dr. Geir Hasnes, Chesterton Bibliographer and editor of Chesterton in Black and White, and Dr. Dermot Quinn, professor of history at Seton Hall University and editor of the Chesterton Review. We live in an age of science. So many of our achievements, healthcare, energy, communication, and industry may be traced to the brilliant work of men and women in laboratories. But so many of our problems, too, seem to have a scientific root. We're slaves to our gadgets. We have phones that seem smarter than us. We can prolong life at its end, but destroy it at its beginning. We can blow up the world. Everywhere we're told the answer to our problems is to follow the science, even if those problems were caused by science in the first place. All of the achievements of science, even with few of us would like to relinquish, have come at a cost. Today's conversation will look at two men who thought about science in powerful and penetrating ways. The English writer G.K. Chesterton, although not a scientist, had important things to say about the natural world and natural theology. In fact, according to Father Stanley Jaki, he was a seer of science, a man with deeper insight into nature of scientific knowledge than many scientists themselves. Father Jaki himself, a brilliant philosopher and physicist, was also an important and insightful thinker about science, religion, and the modern world. The author of over 40 books and winner of the Templeton Prize for Religion in 1987. He was among the best-known priest-scientists of the 20th century. The conference will consist of a set of reflections of the scientific thought of both men, followed by a conversation and question and answers. I am now very pleased to introduce to you our today's speakers. Dr. Robert Moynihan holds a PhD in medieval studies from Yale University. He is founder and editor-in-chief of Inside the Vatican magazine, now in its 30th year of publication. He has appeared as a Vatican analyst on many networks and is author of several books. His 2005 book, The Spiritual Vision of Pope Benedict XVI, Let God Shine Forth, was based on more than 25 interviews with Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict, over many years. His other books include Pray for Me, The Life and Spiritual Vision of Pope Francis in 2013, and Find It Vigano, In Search of the Man Whose Testimony Shook the Church and the World in 2020. His Moynihan letters with timely news and commentary arrive in the inboxes of more than 100,000 email readers. Dr. Dermot Quinn is professor of history at Seton Hall University and editor of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and New College, Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes and has authored 3 books: The Irish in New Jersey, 4 Centuries of American Life, Patronage and Piety, The Politics of English Roman Catholicism, 1850 to 1900, and Understanding Northern Ireland. He has also authored many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history. Dr. Geir Hasnes is Assistant Professor of Engineering Cybernetics at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Dr. Hasnes has been working on a comprehensive bibliography of G.K. Chesterton, for which he was awarded the American Chesterton Society's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2006. He has recently edited Chesterton in Black and White, a collection of essays by Chesterton published in 1903 and 1904 in the weekly magazines Black and White and The Bystander. Dr. Hasnes joins us from Kongsberg, Norway. After the conversation segment, we will have a Q&A period. If you have any questions, kindly post them to the chat function. If in due time we're not able to answer your questions, please send them by email to chestertoninstitute@shu.edu, indicating who the question is directed to so we can reply to you promptly. I now leave you with your speakers, Dr. Robert Moynihan, Dr. Geir Hasnes, and Dr. Dermot Quinn. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, for those very kind words of introduction, and thank you everybody at home for or wherever you are for joining us this afternoon. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to be in collaboration with our friends at Inside the Vatican. This is the first time that the Chesterton Institute has teamed up with Dr. Moynihan and his colleagues at Inside the Vatican, and I hope it's not the last time, because we have, I think, many things in common and all sorts of wonderful opportunities for healthy collaboration. So I'm going to give a few remarks on Chesterton and Father Jaki and the whole question of following the science, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Moynihan, who has a few thoughts on, so to speak, the hows and whys of science. And then we'll hear from Dr. Hasnes, who is a kind of a remarkably distinguished bibliographer of Chesterton and deeply knowledgeable about Chesterton, but also a friend of Father Jaki, and I think Dr. Hasnes may have some images to show us of Father Jaki in Norway. At any rate, of the many descriptions that G.K. Chesterton has enjoyed over the years, one of the most intriguing is that, as Gloria says, he was a seer of science. Chesterton was not a scientist, of course, but he had profound things to say about science and scientism. And he would not have been surprised, although I think he would have been dismayed, that the phrase that has defined the last 12 months is "follow the science." In a broader sense, that is the phrase that has defined the last 300 years. Since the 16th and 17th centuries, the natural sciences have gone from triumph to triumph, leaving other disciplines struggling to catch up. Since the early modern period, it is the natural philosopher, the scientist, who has been seen as the bearer of light, the scatterer of darkness. The other disciplines, to the extent that they wish to be taken seriously, must adopt the methods of the natural science, thus political science, social science, legal science, even domestic science. So to be a seer of science is no small matter. Well, follow the science is a slogan, but it is also a philosophy. As a slogan, it is a demand, in essence, to suspend critical inquiry at precisely the moment when we need it most, telling us not to think, but to obey. As a philosophy, it is an effort to extend scientific ideas, methods, practices, and attitudes to matters of human, social, and political concern. And it seems to me that neither as slogan nor philosophy should it command uncritical assent. After all, scientists themselves follow the science by questioning it. What makes their discipline compelling is not its certainty, but its uncertainty, its epistemological openness, its willingness to be proven wrong. Good science exhibits what Chesterton called healthy hesitation and healthy complexity, a degree of caution in making claims about the physical world that, even at their best, are necessarily provisional. Bad science throws that caution to the winds, mistaking its models of reality for reality itself. Complete self-confidence is not merely a sin, Chesterton wrote in Orthodoxy. Complete self-confidence is a weakness. And that's good advice for all of us, and it is certainly good advice for scientists. Scientists need to have what Walter Lippmann once referred to as the saving doubt of their own certainty. Well, one scientist who has written illuminatingly about this is Guy Consolmagno, who is the Jesuit director of the Vatican Observatory. And here he is in a fine article, I commend it to all of us, a fine article in Faith and Reason, which was published last October. Here he says, here he is. Of course, science is not infallible. I am a scientist, and I can name any number of papers I have written that have turned out to be embarrassingly incorrect. There are times in our history when the science, or at least how it is presented to the general public, has turned out to be not merely imperfect, but horrifyingly wrong. And at that point, he begins to talk about eugenics, essentially. The fight over following the science, and this is Dr. Consolmagno again, the fight over following the science is really a fight over the reliability of authority in general. At the end of the day, both those who promote science and those who disdain it are looking for certainty in an uncertain universe. It is an almost Calvinistic intolerance of error. The world is black and white, and failure is not an option. If only we could be certain, we tell ourselves, if only we could be without doubt. The irony is that science is actually a process based on doubt and error, and on learning how to analyze that error. In science, it is essential to know that you don't know all the answers. In science, and here he is again, in science, failure isn't an option, it is a requirement. Well, I think Brother Consolmagno is entirely right. As Karl Popper pointed out decades ago, a scientific theory which is not open to the possibility of being falsified is a bad theory, and it will make for bad science. There's also a sense, I think, in which both Consolmagno and Popper are casting doubt, in a very Chestertonian way, on the cult of the expert. In fact, of all of Chesterton's notions, that was one of the most powerful. Without education, he once wrote in the Illustrated London News, we are in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people seriously. Or here he is again, speaking of the absurdity of scientism. This is the great fallacy in the case of what is called the impartiality of men of science. If scientific men had no idea beyond their scientific work, it might be all very well. But the truth is that beyond their scientific ideas, they have not the absence of ideas, but the presence of the most vulgar and sentimental ideas that happen to be common to their social clique. If a biologist had no views on art and morals, it might be all very well. The truth is that the biologist has all the wrong views of art and morals that happen to be going about in the smart set of his time. So it was Father Stanley Jaki who called Chesterton a seer of science, writing a fine book about him with that as its subtitle, and doing much to promote Chesterton's scientific thought inside and outside the world of the natural sciences. Combining an exceptionally powerful intellect with a certain polemical pugnacity, Jaki resembled Chesterton as one who could convey difficult ideas in a very direct manner. Awarded the Templeton Prize in 1987 for his immense contribution to bridging the gap between science and religion. At his death in 2009, he was described by the New York Times as a relentless scholar with over 40 books to his credit, including studies of the French physicist Pierre Duhem and John Henry Newman. His best known book is probably The Relevance of Physics, published in 1966. And the relevance of physics is an extended examination of how our ways of seeing the world have changed over time. How sometimes we have understood material reality as a pattern of numbers and at other times as a biological mechanism. Galileo was not the first or last scientist to think that if his mathematics worked, his theory was correct. And such faith in numbers, Jaki asserted, is a form of superstition, a belief in the model as an end in itself to be protected at all costs. St. Robert Bellarmine, contending with Galileo, had little difficulty in showing how this kind of thinking rests on a simple logical error. Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, explores the same notion at greater length, speaking of the paradigm shifts that enabled new ways of doing science in the early modern period. Quinn wrote as a philosopher and historian of science, but in many ways his best known work is a sociology of knowledge. Scientists work in groups and are as susceptible to groupthink, what Francis Bacon called the idols of the market. They are as susceptible to that as the rest of us. So, why did Father Jaki admire Chesterton so much? Well, I think a good place to start is the Ethics of Elfland chapter of Chesterton's book Orthodoxy, a chapter as curious and brilliant as its title. Father Jaki thought that it was essential to Chesterton's scientific thinking, and here is part of it. There are certain sequences or developments, cases of one thing following another, which are, in the true sense of the word, reasonable. They are, in the true sense of the word, necessary. Such are mathematical and merely logical sequences. If the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is, in an iron and awful sense, necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters. But as I began to take notice of the natural world, I observed an extraordinary thing. I observed that learned men in spectacles were talking of the actual things that happened, dawn and death and so on, as if they were rational and inevitable. They talked as if the trees bear fruit, were just as necessary as the fact that two and one trees make three. But it is not. All the terms used in the science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, are really unintellectual because they assume an inner synthesis which we do not possess. Well, it seems to me that David Hume, the Scottish atheist philosopher, could not have put it better. Because if you recall Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding, he argues that factual claims have a different logical status from analytical claims. The latter known to us to be true or false simply by thinking about them, and the former, factual claims, known to be true or false by the test of experience. We know that the swan is white or black by looking at it. We cannot know it in any other way. But here the similarity between Chesterton and Hume, I think, ends. Hume's project in the inquiry concerning human understanding was to destroy metaphysics. Cast it into the flames, he said, because it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. The greatest illusion, of course, being the religious belief that was made possible by metaphysical fantasies, as Hume thought them. But if his primary purpose was to dethrone metaphysics, his secondary effect was to dethrone the natural sciences as a set of necessary claims about the nature of the world. After all, Hume had shown that there is no such thing as inductive logic, and that strict proof simply plays no part in human life outside mathematics. Well, few philosophers have wielded a wrecking ball as formidably as Hume, but many of his admirers seem not to recognize precisely what he has ruined. Those who celebrate his destruction of metaphysics and turn instead to positivist and exclusively scientific accounts of the world often fail to notice that he has destroyed those as well. Well, for his part, Chesterton understood that in the science of mental relations, there really are laws. In the realm of physical facts, there are no laws, but only, as he puts it, weird repetitions. Hume said that the world does not explain itself. And Chesterton replied that that is precisely the point. Facts are arbitrary and mysterious. The weird repetitions become no less weird for being repeated. The startling strangeness of the world is an invitation to wonder and to gratitude. A tree grows fruit, he said, because it is a magic tree. Hume was interested in the weird repetitions because we mistakenly believe them to be necessary. Chesterton was interested in them because we know that they are not necessary at all, and yet, to our benefit, they recur. Existence itself was so very eccentric a legacy that I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not understand the vision they limited. You could not, he said, look a gift universe in the mouth. Well, that kind of idea, that kind of reasoning was enormously appealing to Father Jaki. And Jaki was not alone in considering Chesterton's book on Aquinas among the deepest of all his writings. Etienne Gilson famously hailed it as, without possible comparison, the best book ever written on St. Thomas. Nothing short of genius can account for such an achievement. If it is a work of genius, that is not so much because Chesterton understood St. Thomas as because he understood what Thomas understood. That the primary and fundamental part of the Catholic philosophy is entirely the praise of life, the praise of being, the praise of God as the creator of the world. Everything else, Chesterton said, follows a long way behind that. And Chesterton, I think, explores Thomas's ontology, his account of being, with uncommon brilliance. Here he is in this wonderful book, Thomas Aquinas. There is no doubt about the being of being, even if it does sometimes look like becoming. That is because what we see is not the fullness of being. We never see being as much as it can. Ice is melted into cold water, and cold water is heated into hot water. It cannot be all three at once. But this does not make water unreal or even relative. It only means that its being is limited to being one thing at a time. St. Thomas maintains that the ordinary thing at any moment is something, but it is not everything that it could be. Thus, while most sages come at last to nothing but naked change, he comes to the ultimate thing that is unchangeable, he being Thomas. He comes to the ultimate thing that is unchangeable, because it is all the other things at once. While they describe a change which is really a change in nothing, he describes a changelessness which includes the changes of everything. Things change because they are not complete, but their reality can only be explained as part of something that is complete. It is God. And this God, and I'm now no longer quoting Chesterton, this God is a creator God. Aquinas was quite certain that even if the world were entirely without end or beginning, which he denies, it still has logical need of a creator. And it is the createdness of things, their contingency, that allows us to glimpse the uncreated God who has given them to us as pure gift. Well, it is easy to see, I think, listening to that, it is easy to see how Jaki, as priest and scientist, was so taken with Chesterton. In summarizing the Summa, Chesterton offered in popular form a statement of Jaki's own core convictions, which Jaki himself summarized in 1978. And what are his core convictions, he said? The existence of mind as distinct from matter, the fundamental importance for scientific method of an epistemology embodied in the classical proofs of the existence of God, the limited validity or relevance of exact science or physics, the crucial importance of Christian belief in creation for the unique rise of science. Such ideas were not uniquely the property of Aquinas and Chesterton, of course, but Aquinas and Chesterton were powerful exponents of them. So, to conclude, what might they have said to us this afternoon? First of all, I think they might have said, beware of following the scientist and thinking that that is the same as following the science. Then they would have insisted, in good Thomistic fashion, that we can reason our way to certain understandings of the material world, and that those understandings have been immensely beneficial to us in all sorts of ways. Thirdly, they would have deplored the terrible things done in the name of science, not just bad thinking, but bad actions and evil public policy. Finally, and most importantly, they would have said, by all means, follow the science, and if you do, you will find that it leads you to God. Well, I now offer the floor to Dr. Moynihan, and I believe Dr. Moynihan will amplify or maybe indeed criticize what I've said, but I think Dr. Moynihan is going to help us think a little more about the hows and the whys of science.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here to discuss these questions. And I'm here really, in a real sense, because of G.K. Chesterton. I read him when I was a teenager, almost 50 years ago. And I came across The Everlasting Man. And I came across the biographies you referenced of Thomas Aquinas, of St. Francis. And Chesterton seemed to be a kind of prophetic guide to protect us from sinking down solely into the material. And that was a time when the science, the technology of the United States was expanding its claim to say we can explain everything. We can explain your thoughts, we can explain your desires, we can explain your hopes. We have a kind of physical understanding of the world that will finally explain even your faith. So I found in Chesterton a kind of a friend. And years later, a few years ago, I visited England and went to his grave. And I went to his library. It looks a little like the library that our friend is in Norway. It was filled with so many books. And then I noticed so many years of his journals, so many years of his different magazines, how much he had written. So I was deeply impressed by that. And I thank him for being a kind of friend and guide. And Jaki, it's Dr. and Father Stanley Jaki, was a kind of pyrotechnic figure coming out of the heart of Europe, speaking as a scientist about the limitations of science and about the necessity for a certain humility. He himself did not take fools lightly, and he was a strong man, a Hungarian. And he wrote as a kind of guide also on these questions of this society we have today, this mental world we live in, which is in some way what Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict referred to as totalitarian. It wants to take all the space. And it really wants to collapse the metaphysical. You just said that a few minutes ago. That Hume, in his vision, wished to destroy the metaphysical because he felt it was unreal. Later, the communists came and the Bolsheviks came, and they said that the entire concept of faith and the concept of heaven, the concept of God, all of these things needed to be destroyed because they were unreal. They were myths. They had nothing to do with the real, which is what science deals with. So in a sense, what we are discussing is the great question of our age. And it's whether there are sort of two stories in the world, or in reality, let's say matter and spirit, or we might call it material and spiritual, or we might also call it time and eternity. Maybe these people would say there is no spiritual and there is no eternity. And we extend that to say there's a world that we live in which is a fallen world. It's certainly not heaven, but there is another world that we look forward to, which St. Paul speaks about, called heaven. So it's now and not yet. And then there's another concept we have, which is that this fallen world needs to be redeemed, or in fact has been redeemed. And then there is that world which that redemption will be manifest, will be experienced. So these are concepts that for 2,000 and really well over 2,000 years have been part of the consciousness of Western man, and really a question also that globally has preoccupied men and women, thoughtful men and women. And I wanted to just explore this for a moment and not pretend to make an exhaustive analysis in 5 or 10 minutes, but to give almost an impressionistic, Monet-like picture of where we stand. We stand before a claim of the scientists that everything we hold dear, we must abandon out of loyalty to science, which they say is truth. And I respond that it's not all the truth. They've left something out of their equation, and in fact, they've left the most important thing out. And that's the nature of the battle we face. And the central point of that battle is, what is man? What is man? What is man that thou art mindful of him? On the one hand, we seem to be conscious. We seem to have a mind that could imagine standing in St. Peter's Square, or standing in Times Square in New York, or standing, or maybe hiking up Mount Everest. In our imagination and in our reach, we have colossal powers in memory and in anticipation. And one of the great figures in our tradition taught a great deal about man. That was St. Augustine. And he spent his whole life trying to understand what it was to have a mind, to have a conscious mind, and then try to have that conscious mind become content, become peaceful. And he said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So what he was saying was, men cannot be content, cannot be happy, cannot be blessed until they find God, until they find something that transcends all that they see and hear, transcends the material, transcends the things of time. They must somehow grasp or encounter or experience, even in a mystical way, the eternal, the holy, the spiritual, that which is above. And if they never do, they will always feel that lack. Now, that echoes what Jesus himself said. Jesus, who spoke to the crowds, who called a group of his disciples around him, who finally was rejected and executed, when he was speaking, he repeatedly said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And then St. Paul later interpreted that to say, "Be not conformed to the world." And What he further said is that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So as you take that first phrase, my kingdom is not of this world, it means there's another kingdom or another world. People might say this is lunacy, this is foolishness, but Jesus said it. How do we find that kingdom? Where is it? It's invisible, and in fact, it's immaterial, it's spiritual. So the mechanisms and the tools of science cannot access it, can't take photographs of it, can't measure it, can't weigh it. So science in 2,000 years has had its ups and downs, and strangely, we developed a type of antagonism between what we would call science and faith. And that is what Father Jaki attempted to overcome, to give due space, which I think is legitimate and good, to the scientific endeavor. And I think there have been great people of faith who have been scientists. So it's not a rejection of science, but it is an attempt to say there is something beyond or above or beneath the limitations that science has, which are to deal only with material things, only with things of time, only the things that can be measured. Now, during my lifetime, I came across a number of people who guided me along this path, this question of what is man and how does he find this encounter with that which will bring rest to his mind or to his heart or to his soul. And Augustine was one of the more important. But then in our own time, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote the book, Man's Search for Meaning. I would say this is in some way a scientific search for something that science cannot grasp, the meaning of anything or the meaning of everything. But what Viktor Frankl, who was a prisoner in a concentration camp and survived, he was from Vienna, and then he came to America. And what he wrote is the people who survived were the people who had a sense of meaning. There's a connection between meaning and life. And reading his book, I felt that that impulse to try to seek out further what the meaning of things is. And what he later developed was something beyond what Sigmund Freud and even Carl Jung had developed, a new study of psychology, and it involved logotherapy, he called it. The therapy of our maladies and our mental illnesses by giving meaning, by giving logos. And from that point on, back really in my 20s, back as a graduate student, the idea of logos became central to me, and I repeatedly reflected on the fact that that's how the universe is created in the book of Genesis, by God speaking a word, let there be light. And then how it begins the Gospel of St. John, who said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the question, what is a word? And we say that Christ is the Logos. Christ is the Word of God. He's the incarnate reality that it is the enfleshment of the absolute meaning of our universe, which is to be a person and to be a loving person and to be a forgiving and sacrificial person. So I started to, along this pathway, which took me also to Rome, to conversations with Joseph Ratzinger, sometimes on these type of questions. But one of my other guides was a man named Walker Percy. He was an American Catholic novelist. I wrote a thesis in college about his work. And he said, that he had lost all desire to live, because even though he was a great scientist and he was a doctoral student, he was a student of medicine at Columbia Surgeons College in New York City, and then he caught tuberculosis, experimenting with tuberculosis tissue, and he went 2 years to a sanatorium in upstate New York, and he almost died. He started reading the existentialist philosophers, and he came to understand that there had to be a meaning to life. There had to be an encounter with that meaning, with let's say, the word that gives meaning. And he didn't have that. He was a smart man. He was a kind of an agnostic, or you might call him a stoic. But after a while, he started reading the Christian existentialists and Gabriel Marcel, and he started seeking out the back pews of churches. And then eventually he started to take instruction, and he became a Roman Catholic. And he became a deeply Eucharistic Catholic. And he said, the word is among us also in the Eucharist, which I can't go into at great length, but it's a great mystery. This is my body. So I went to meet Walker Percy. I drove a car, the first car I ever had, I bought for $440, and I drove it to New Orleans. And I had an afternoon, and I showed Percy my thesis, and he said, "You've understood me well." The next day he said that to me. And then I left him. I never saw him again. But what was it that was interesting about Percy was that he too focused on the word. He wasn't just a novelist putting words together in novels, but he wrote a series of essays on semiotics, on the difference between signals and signs. And at the heart of that, there's one story he tells about Helen Keller. Helen Keller was born blind, deaf, and dumb in the 1800s. And then she had a nurse named Miss Anne who tried to get her to speak. And she would hold one hand under a faucet of water, and she would hold the other hand and trace the letters W-A-T-E-R. But how do we know this? Because Helen Keller eventually learned to speak and to write and to talk and to give lectures, and she told this story. Otherwise, this would be one of the infinite number of things that we wouldn't know about in history. Or maybe she never would have learned to speak, but what she tells us at about the age of 8 or 9, one day after having done this dozens and hundreds of times, she suddenly understood that the word water was the cool liquid flowing over her hand, and she fused the material with something that is sort of the antechamber of the spiritual, a word, something that isn't physical but connects with the physical because we express it. It has wavelength, maybe a different timbre, but it is also beyond the physical because it's an idea, it's a concept, it can be grasped by the mind and studied, and it applies itself, it names something. The word names the water, the word, but she expressed it this way, the word was the water. But she said, having understood that, a light went on in my mind, and I started to ask her the names of everything in the house. And it was like the dawn of creation, and Adam and Eve naming all the creatures. So the idea of using a word, being linguistic, entering into logos, struck me as related to the search for God, search for meaning, the search for salvation. So then years passed by, and I continued sort of wrestling with these questions. And I remember having a meeting in about 2001, I think, in the summertime in Rome with the man who was the spokesman for Pope John Paul II. His name was Dr. Joaquin Navarro Valls. And I sat at his desk and I said, listen, how can we, I'm trying to write something about the church today and this pontificate. What's the essence of it? He said, the essence of it is that the question of man, the anthropological question, is at the center of John Paul's thought, and it's at the center of our age. And this is the question that Stanley Jaki dealt with as he tried to defend science while keeping some space for faith and for meaning. And it was certainly what Chesterton defended as he tried to say that if you limit to what you can weigh and measure and quantify, and you say nothing else is real, you're a truncated soul. You don't express the deepest things, and you don't find the deepest things. It's not that science is wrong, but it's limited or truncated. And there's a quote I have from him. This is Chesterton. Such a man, his cosmos, says Chesterton, may be complete in every rivet and cogwheel, but still his cosmos is smaller than our world. Somehow his scheme, like the lucid scheme of a madman, seems unconscious of the alien energies and the large indifferences of the earth. It is not thinking of the real things of the earth, of fighting peoples, or proud mothers, or first love, or fear upon the sea. Now, this is rhetoric. You could still scoff and say, that's just Chesterton sort of giving a rhetorical flourish to his crutch-like belief that there is something more. But it's haunting to me that you cannot embrace the things most precious to us, which are personal, which are human and to deal with persons, unless you have meaning in them, unless you have love, sacrifice, things that you can't predict, unless you have free will and choice and sacrifice, choosing to give up pleasure to love somebody. In other words, science can depict a world to us, but a world without personhood. And this is why the fascinating thing about our current sort of crossroads as we try now with tremendous new powers, because the computer is getting faster and faster and faster. The Chinese are gathering data from everywhere. The Americans are gathering. They're getting not billions, but trillions and quadrillions of bits of data. What do people do at a stop sign? Where do they turn into Dunkin' Donuts? What time do they fall asleep? How many steps do they take? This data is being preserved and cross-referenced, and they're almost able to predict our behavior. So the idea is advancing that we will have artificial intelligence and that it will surpass man. We call this transhumanism. And in a sense, C.S. Lewis had a study called The Abolition of Man, and that is what I am now afraid of. And that's why I'm very interested in Chesterton, in Jaki, but above all, in this whole Christian tradition, which I do not believe diminishes man or keeps man tied to foolish fables, but ennobles man and opens access to the deepest things, which then protect the things that in our daily life are most beautiful and precious to us. So, what is man? Man is a creature who is in this material world and in using his senses, dealing with matter, but who is not in himself unless he transcends himself. That's the paradox. That's what's being denied. But that is what is being preached to us by Moses when he tells us that God appeared to him in the burning bush and the bush burnt but was not consumed. It's what Jesus told us when he said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word. It's what Augustine told us when he said, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. It's what Viktor Frankl told us when he said, if we don't have meaning, if we don't encounter a kind of ground of meaning, our lives will be rudderless and oriented towards decline and death. So our society as a whole is at a crossroads. People like Chesterton and Jaki gave us enormous help to prepare us for this battle, but the battle is still before us. The battle really with computers, with scientists that claim 100% of the space. And I think this is what we are engaged with also in this conversation. And I hope we can defend the deep truth about man, the deep truth that John Paul II preached, which is that we are sons and daughters of God, but we are, in a sense, pilgrims in a fallen world seeking our way home, and that this is the beauty and the tragedy of our existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moynihan. Oh.
Yeah, no. I was going to do what Gloria is doing, which is to Dr. Moynihan, and I think now we hand it over to Norway and to Dr. Hasnes.
Yes, thank you, both of you, for everything you have said, which renders much of what I was going to say unnecessary to say, or just a repetition, because you have stated so many things. It feels like when reading a report from when Chesterton has been the main speaker, and he has been introduced by two other speakers, and he only has to say that they said everything that I wanted to say, so I just have to go on talking about something else. But then again, he said about his title, the lecture title he used very often, the culture and the coming period. He used it because actually he did not know what it meant. So there you are. But the thing is that Chesterton and Father Jaki and me and Sigrid Undset came together in a very special way. And therefore I made this PowerPoint, and I will try to do it as quickly as I can. Now let me see. There, yes. So now you can see my points for the conversation about Father Jaki. And first, this is just a possible coincidence, because Father Jaki spent his study days at Pannonhalma Archabbey in northwestern Hungary. It's really in the heart of Europe. And he spent 5 years there, 1942 to 1947. And I also found for my bibliography that there was a Benedictine there, Olaios A. Elred, who wrote a doctoral dissertation on Chesterton, and it was also published in Budapest in 1943. So at least somebody was very, very occupied with Chesterton at the same time as the young Stanley Jaki was strolling here in Pannonhalma. Well, Father Jaki very late actually discovered Sigrid Undset's essay, Letter to a Parish Priest, and he found it so important that he wanted to publish it in Real View Books, where he published more than 100 books and booklets like these. And then he went to a Chesterton conference in Minneapolis, and he met with me, and I told him that if he wanted to study and do research on Sigrid Undset, well, I could drive him to Sigrid Undset's home in Norway. So we took 2 trips to Sigrid Undset's estate in Norway in 2006 and 2007, and wrote this book on her, Sigrid Undset's Quest for Truth, because Sigrid Undset became a Catholic. Sigrid Undset actually read first the lives of the saints, and then a collection of books by Robert Hugh Benson. And then she bought books by Belloc and Chesterton, and Chesterton became her favorite author. So after she converted to Catholicism, she actually took a year off to translate The Everlasting Man by Chesterton into Norwegian, and she also had her stepdaughter translate The Catholic Church and Conversion. And because Chesterton would not sell in Norway because he was Catholic, she paid for the printing, the publication, everything by herself. Now here is Bjerkebæk. It's in May 2007, and here Father Jaki and I am standing. And behind this window, framed in blue, Sigrid Undset wrote Kristin Lavransdatter. The farmhouse to the right here was bought for the money earned on Kristin Lavransdatter, and here is Sigrid Undset made her own writing room. And on the second floor is her bedroom, and we shall look into that. But first, the house to the left here was an original part of the estate, and after Sigrid Undset returned, after 5 years in the US during the war, she filled it with 4,000 books that she had amassed in the US during those years. So yes, and I was amazed to see that she had kept all the dust jackets too. And they are here still. And here we have Father Jaki together with the curator of Sigrid Undset's estate. The estate is called Bjerkebæk, which means the brook that runs through an area of birches. Very poetical. And Father Jaki, he spoke to everyone, he asked, he was so inquisitive, you have no idea. And so here we went up to Sigrid Undset's bedroom. Here you can see a prayer stool, even icons, and this is her devotional wall, actually. And here also you can see Summa Theologica standing on the shelf beneath the window to the left. And actually to the right, there is a lot of books she had got from Jacques Maritain. She kept in very close contact with many Catholics in Europe. And here is Sigrid Undset's living room, and to the left, the entrance to her writing room. And Father Jaki marveled about being able to visit her estate, because he was of the impression that the Germans had taken everything and destroyed it. But the first miracle is that all her books were taken in custody by friends and were hid during the Second World War, and brought back to her. And the second miracle is, of course, that her library was kept being where it was for 50 years, or nearly 50 years, because her son and daughter-in-law did not use the estate. So it was kept for 48 years until the Norwegian state bought the whole thing. And so here we can see the librarian also that had been hired to catalog Sigrid Undset's library, and she had almost finished it when Father Jaki came here, and so he could use the library catalog too when he wrote his book on Sigrid Undset. And therefore it is possibly the best book, the best understanding of Sigrid Undset as a person, not only as a Catholic, but also as a person, of all the books that have been written. And here Father Jaki discovers that Sigrid Undset kept the collected works of Martin Luther on the top shelf. She said she was kept there to be out of reach for the children, because they should not have access to dirty literature, to which Father Jaki laughed heartily. But she had kept it because she wanted to know what her, I think actually she said enemies, what her enemies opinionated. So here is Sigrid Undset's writing room, and with a Belloc shelf and a Benson shelf here, and of course also a Chesterton shelf, or there were two shelves at Chesterton, and he used to say that she wrote with Belloc, Benson and Chesterton behind her back. Actually, she kept all those Catholic English writers in this room here. And this librarian who had been hired to catalog Undset's collection, she would be of great assistance to Father Jaki during his research. So actually, I think he found it like a miracle to be able to come to Bjerkebæk and to access everything in pristine condition, really. So there you are. Yeah, but I had to give you this photograph also when I disturbed them to take another photograph. And he did not only study her books, he also studied her belongings. And here he sits in the room where she wrote Kristin Lavransdatter. And here he is walking with the curator up to the new Sigrid Undset museum that was being erected. At the end of the trip, we went to Mesnali, the Catholic graveyard, and here Father Jaki is kneeling in front of Sigrid Undset's cross. Ti ser jeg Herrens tjenerinne. Mary said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord." So this is what I wanted to show you about Sigrid Undset and Father Jaki, which ended in his splendid book on her. And the thing is, when you read other books by Father Jaki, he's arguing the same way. He is not afraid to tell it like it is. He was very, very disconcerted, I think is the word, with the Catholic theologians who had written on Sigrid Undset. And of course, here it all ended for us. You know, I was fond of Chesterton, and so I went to this conference and I met Father Jaki, and I brought him to Norway, and he wrote on Sigrid Undset, and it was the last large project before he left us for a better place, I would say. So these days I am trying to finish the bibliography properly. Only a few items left to confirm. 60 all in all of the 30 or 40,000 items I have amassed. And yes, 60, 26 Chesterton articles that I have not yet seen, 16 articles on Chesterton that I have not yet found, and some 18 other various pieces. And it dwindles every day. And after that, I think I will be studying Father Jaki because he is so incredibly brilliant. So only to say one thing about him and science is that the problem with science is in the use of concepts. It is in the understanding of what you are talking about. So the thing is, artificial intelligence is not intelligence. It is really instinct. The definition of intelligence in artificial intelligence as used in science is wrong. It is really all about instinct. That is what they want, actually. So I think that there will be a lot of people wishing to ask questions. So thank you from Norway for this time. And I think that the next time we really should do like Chesterton and Cecil Chesterton did, because they spoke for days and days. And it's not restricted to them. It's not a phenomenon. It's something that we should do because we have so much to talk about when we are interested in Chesterton and Father Jaki. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geir, and thank you, Dr. Moynihan, and thank you, Dermot. We do have a couple of questions that I would like to pose. They're not directed to anyone in particular. One of them is, why is Chesterton so popular?
That's a wonderful question, Gloria, and we have spent a long time exploring Chesterton's popularity and sharing in his popularity. And some of the reasons for his popularity, I think, are kind of manifest in our conference this afternoon. Chesterton was a man of extraordinary intellectual brilliance. He was a man of extraordinary intellectual range, and he was a man of, I think, just deep insight. One of the and this, I think, is the point that Dr. Moynihan so eloquently explored, that Chesterton is a philosopher of man in some very profound profound ways. Every book that he wrote is, as he said, you know, he was once asked, why don't you write more about God? And he said, well, everything I write is about God. It's not that I write infrequently about God. Everything that I write is about God. You know, what you see is what Dr. Moynihan kind of drew our attention to, which is this encounter between God and man. And Chesterton is an eloquent exponent, if you will, of the encounter between God and man. And you can see this in his kind of sacramental understanding of literature, where he is, as he said, he kind of smuggles in God into all sorts of areas which don't seem to be particularly invested with God. So Chesterton is popular, you know, at all sorts of levels. I mean, he's also, of course, enormously funny and kind of brilliantly witty, you know, full of suggestive paradoxes where he turns the truth on its head so that he can see that truth more clearly. And I think there's also, quite apart from his literary and philosophical and theological genius, there's simply the attractiveness of his personality. I mean, he is the kind of person that you want to be with. He's the kind of person that you would more than happily share a pint of beer with. You know, Chesterton is a good companion. So he's a good companion just in a very kind of ordinary way. That, I mean, he's a man that you'd like to spend some time with. And if you can't spend time with him personally, you can spend time with them intellectually, and that's what we're trying to do in the Chesterton Institute. That's what Geir is doing in his extraordinary work as a bibliographer, bringing Chesterton's writings to a wider world. You know, when I see the work that Dr. Hasnes has done, I'm absolutely staggered by his achievement. I mean, I remember giving a talk once to a group who were interested in the possibility of Chesterton's being canonized, and I pointed out to them that one of the first requirements of canonization is that the works of the particular person have to be gathered together. And I said, I mean, such was Chesterton's extraordinarily productive literary life that it would be a miracle. It would be his first miracle if his works could be brought together. Well, I think we've kind of seen that miracle with the work that Dr. Hasnes has done. So all over the world, we have in the Chesterton Institute, we are trying to bring Chesterton's ideas to the world, ideas which, as Chesterton himself said, are you know, they're not my ideas. They are, you know, God and man made them, and they made me. But you know, I think we can say that in the work of the Chesterton Institute, we can see all over the world this extraordinary depth of affection for Chesterton, an affection which I think is based on his remarkable intellectual versatility, you know, with as a journalist, as a poet, as a novelist, as a playwright, as a songster. I mean, that extraordinary versatility matched with a kind of an extraordinary insight into the nature of man's encounter with God, and then his extremely attractive personality. I think those are, if you like, in broad summary, the reasons that Chesterton is so popular. But maybe I could ask Dr. Moynihan and Dr. Hasnes to offer some thoughts as well, because you know, they are admirers of Chesterton, so that their own experience of Chesterton is kind of another way of explaining his popularity.
Well, I could say three things. Chesterton makes people who seem sort of dusty and far away come alive. So he has a rare gift for infusing life and freshness into old things, and particularly Thomas of Aquinas and St. Francis in those two biographies, which are really short. But you read those two books, especially teenagers, and suddenly those plaster cast saints are suddenly round figures struggling to find truth, to find goodness, to fight against their own tendencies, and Chesterton enlivens things. Second, his language is a rush, almost Shakespearean in a sense, a volcano of language, phrases that for an English speaker are always interesting for me. He finds new ways of saying things that maybe are old ideas, but he says them in a new way, so he's fresh again. And an example of that, he says orthodoxy is the wild truth, reeling but erect. Now, in those few words, he summarizes battles over the Trinity, over the identity of Mary, the Mother of God, and or over the Eucharist, or over other things, and or all these councils and centuries of church debates, and there were excommunicated heretics, and they finally defined certain truths, and Chesterton defines it. The wild truth, reeling but erect. And then the third thing is paradox, and you referred to that. Young kids like that in particular. I remember when he said, what we have in Catholicism are two contradictory things that the mind wishes to separate, but the truth combines. For example, Jesus being both God and man. So if you want to become someone who denies the humanity, then you become a Docetist. If you want to deny the divinity, you become a Nestorian. And I can't take or Arius really did that. But Catholic Orthodoxy holds both truths, logically contradictory, but holds them in tension at their extreme level of truth. And in that moment, stands in front of a truth that the mind can contemplate, can even understand what it's saying, but not comprehend. It's a mystery, finally. And Chesterton was the one who explained all that to me. The paradox and the fusing of the two extremes and holding both of them in tension. So I love Chesterton for that reason.
It's hard for me when I have a whole library at home and when I have achieved finding almost everything that he wrote. And the first thing when I look at it now is that it is so pure, it's so clean. It is, there are so many things that authors unconsciously let drip into their books or articles or stories, which you do not find in Chesterton. Either he had this complete self-control or of censoring himself, or he was a completely clean soul. Because he is so clean in everything he writes, everything. And even from the start, there is not one drop of evil. In 1913-14, he is on his lowest in the belief of what he is doing himself and society and so on and so forth. But even then, not at all. He is phenomenal in his humility. But of course, this would not be what attracts me most. It's only that it gives a certain stamp of quality to everything he writes. From the beginning, I was laughing about just about everything he wrote, because it was so true and yet so eye-opening. He opened my eyes and he opens people's eyes to see that truth and reality is not what you are told in the newspapers or in the mainstream media. You don't see that because they have a flat, not even two-dimensional view of reality. They are shallow and he is deep, and he lets you into the deep. And the shallow, all the shallowness of ordinary media and ordinary literature, ordinary philosophy, ordinary science, all the shallowness of it, disappears like the snow is melting in the sun in the spring. you see something completely different. So life with Chesterton is so incredibly rich. It also makes you want to read all the authors he has read, because you want to quarrel with him. You want to see if it is in that way, and you want to think about all the things he brings up, and therefore I cannot think of anyone else who makes my mind jump into so many different things to think about. So he is the best, actually. But then again, Father Jaki is quite a great guy, he too. And I counted here because you quoted he has written 40 books. He has written 89 with some compilations of various smaller pieces. So he was extraordinary productive, really. So there is room for many more programs on Father Jaki. I think we have just scratched the surface here. And
I think you're right. I think you're right, Geir. Yeah. Gloria,
well,
are there?
I have one question, maybe because of the time constraint, maybe just like they're looking just for the name. Do you think that Chesterton had any particular scientist in mind when he spoke of science?
Well, I mean, he was certainly critical of Darwin and Darwinism, and you know, you look at the Everlasting Man, and he has a certain amount of sharp commentary on kind of evolution and misunderstandings of what evolution is all about. But I think, and you know, we as you say, a big pardon, Geir?
Eugenics.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he's extremely critical of the eugenicist philosophy, most obviously in Eugenics and Other Evils. And I think just generally, you know, what you see in Chesterton is a kind of deep anxiety about the kind of Prussian philosophy of reducing man to a cog in a machine, you know, man as merely an object, and to that extent, you know, that kind of scientific view of how human beings should be organized and controlled is another kind of scientific heresy that Chesterton is deeply worried by. So those are kind of three ways of thinking about.
How about you, Dr. Moynihan? Do you think there are any scientists?
Just that he felt that the scientists were proud, and rightly so, of penetrating into the study of the stars and the various aspects of the nature around us, but that they had neglected in some way to recall even their own humanity at times, not a blanket, but that they had left a kind of dangerous opening to an ideology which would collapse the metaphysical or the spiritual down into the material. And so he defends man, and he defends the spiritual and the metaphysical from the sort of average scientist who says, this is all there is, we're understanding everything, there's these different types of light waves, and this is all. And we're even now, I think the three of us, or the four of us, and everyone listening can be more scientific than the scientists, in the sense that we recognize we're probably going to understand and come to discover things that we don't even know about now, which we know that light and sound and the various vibrations, there's health and things that change in our bodies that have to do with the vibrations of things and the magnetism and things which we know nothing about. And we're not against studying these things. But science tends to murder, to dissect. I'm not sure if that's his phrase, but somebody uses it. They take a very small area and they study your sugar level or your something, and they say this is now going to be cured with some pill. And the side effects of it because we are truly holistic, we're truly scientific. And I appreciate every bit of science, but when they start denying that there are things that are outside of that very narrow vision that they've had to take in order to study something deeply, if they deny the outside, they're becoming truly anti-scientific. So there's a kind of anti-science that is embedded in the science that we take normatively in our schools and colleges, and often the kind of rebel scientist will overturn everything. You mentioned scientific revolutions, I think Quinn's study, and we may have a whole new paradigm for many different things beyond what we can imagine. And Chesterton kept the way open to that, and Jaki did certainly as well. So in that they were truly broad-minded men, not narrow-minded.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we have received a couple of other questions, and as we said at the beginning, we will pass these questions on to our speakers, and so that you can reply to them. There are 3 or 4, and as we come to a close, I would like to thank, on behalf of the Chesterton Institute and Inside the Vatican magazine, our speakers, Dr. Moynihan, Dr. Geir Hasnes, and Dr. Quinn, for such a wonderful conversation. And of course, I would like to send everyone, say thank you to everyone who joined us today from wherever you are at this time. In the next few days, we will send out a notice with a link to view the video recording of this presentation. But before we end, we would like to just take a moment to share a couple of little information. If you would like to continue or if you're new, to join our mailing list so that you receive all the notices about our events, please write us to chestertoninstitute@shu.edu. I will share that with Inside the Vatican so that we all have you in our list. And of course, if you enjoyed today's presentation, we're sure that you're going to enjoy reading our fall-winter 2021 issue, which is devoted to Father Jaki. If you would like to subscribe or any more information, please, Dr. Hasnes is showing it there. Just write to us and we will help you obtain a copy of subscribe and also if you would like to subscribe to Inside the Vatican, you can visit their website at www.insidethevatican.com, where you can subscribe there directly. Once again, we thank our speakers for their great presentations, and we thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you will be able to join us for future programs. So with nothing else to go over at this moment, although we do have a lot of things that we can continue the conversation, we bid you goodbye, and until the next time, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you.